making of Elephant's Dream session now. We have everybody here except for Basse, who was the sandwich maker who couldn't make it this morning due to the strike. So I will give it to Bassam, the director of the movie, and good luck.
Hello. Welcome to the very unprepared Elephant's Dream making off session. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we made the movie. We'll show some of the production files that we worked on and sort of dissect a little bit how we did certain things, like some of the composites, some of the rigging tricks. We'll go over the project and we'll show some of the Easter eggs and fun things that we kind of hid in the production files and in the final movie. And we'll talk about the process, how we did it, and things like that. We'll also talk about some of the technical things behind it that weren't necessarily Blender things. Tony will talk a little bit about setting up the rendering pipeline and various tricks he did so we could get our files back and forth to the render farm, which was off-site. And are we ready?
Yeah.
No, okay, we're not really ready yet.
That's okay. We can just start from the start. Do you want me to talk?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is this on even? No. I guess we should just talk about exactly what happens if you guys aren't totally familiar with what went on. I know a few of you guys were at the premiere, so you've had a bit of a chance to talk to us and see what things are about then. But anyway, Ton said it was briefly. It was set up just with the 6 of us working in the studio in Amsterdam over 7 months. We worked on the movie and we finished it with a couple of days to spare, having the premiere in, what was it, April? March this year. So we were working at Montevideo, which is the Media Arts Institute in Amsterdam. We had a small studio where we basically lived, because having such a small amount of people who had never worked together, who had never worked on any sort of projects like this before, it was really, really challenging at the start. We lost a lot of time, which means that we lost a lot of sleep, and we had to work very, very hard. The original time frame that we had was totally unrealistic compared to actually what happened. If any of you guys were here at this time last... Don't look at me like that, Ton. It's your... Yeah. Well, if any of you guys were here last year at the conference, we were presenting to you guys a teaser. The idea was that we would do all of the concept design that we needed in order to start the movie immediately. We would produce this teaser, show it at the Blender conference in October, and then start production straight away. And of course, that didn't even come close to happening. We put the teaser together in about a week of insane work when none of the actual shots from the teaser were in the movie, and very little of the teaser actually had anything to do with the movie except for the 2 characters and the ducks. But we did it, and then we went back to continue working on it. And we spent a lot more time, it was at least until what, December, until we really started real production, wasn't it? I think so.
What do you mean by production?
Well, actual shots.
Yeah. Well, we did a lot of tests before that, and I think we could start animation way before we had the actual scenes or the sets or anything. So I think that was about November, December or so, until we had our studio set up and everything. Don't let me talk about that. Well, that was a whole lot of problems concerning our studio setup. We didn't have a studio at the start, so the first weeks when we got here, we actually had to set up our studio first. Don't look at me like that. Yeah, we didn't have computers. Luckily, Montevideo, the Media Art Institute, lent us a couple of computers and screens, so we could at least start doing something, concept sketching and stuff. And well, over the next couple of weeks, we got tables, we got chairs, we got computers and everything. So that was about the time when we could think about starting really.
So after the conference, we spent another couple of months, September, November, rest of October, working out more concept designs, working out more rigging stuff, because we'd actually planned in this nicely optimistic timeline that we would have these things done in certain stages that we would then move on to the next thing, but it didn't really work that way at all. Basically, a lot of things were happening in parallel. So we started animating when the rigs were nowhere near final, and Bassam spent weekends over the next 3 months or so continually tweaking the rigs and tweaking the sort of correction shapes. Because at the start they were just deforming terribly. They didn't have any sort of correction, and it was just there so we could get the animation in. So a lot of things were happening in parallel. People were animating, people were texturing and UV mapping things all at the same time. And it started to work out once we actually got into a rhythm of how this was actually working, because it took a little while at the start. We didn't really expect it to be working that way because of all of our plans at the start. So it took some time to adjust to what was really going on. So we started animation in December or so. And by that time, we actually had finalized a script, because that took a long time as well. We were working with an external script writer. It took a lot of revisions. One thing that was interesting was that we only realized this at the last minute after sort of being in denial about it for a while. But we were using a playwright as a script who'd done a lot of interesting plays, performed in all around Europe. But we realized that the major difference between writing a play and writing animation is that in some ways they're quite opposite, because in a play if you've just got a couple of characters on a stage and everything is left up to the audience's imagination or what you actually tell them. So if there's going to be some giant cavern full of birds and machinery or something, you can't really put that on a stage. You have to say in the script, oh, look at that giant cavern full of birds and machinery and things, and try and get the audience to understand what you're talking about. But in an animation, you don't do that at all. You just show it there on the screen. So we had a script that was very, very, very wordy, and which would also mean it would be very difficult to lip sync the whole thing, which is very time consuming. So we had to change the script a lot from being a theatre script to an animation script, which really turned out to be quite different, and we weren't really prepared for that at all. But we did it in November or so, and we started animating on what we have.
Talking about animation, did we start? We didn't really start straight away with the animation. We did animatics first. Yeah. That is, we turned the script into a rough version of the movie with proxy sets, proxy characters, really rough animation, and we basically, I think we remade the movie twice before we could actually start, so we can see the. Do we have the animatic here somewhere? No. Crappy-matic. We have some crappy-matic scenes on there. Well, if you copied them over, there. Let's get the DVD. Luckily, everything is. Yeah. Well, maybe Bassam and I, we should talk about the period before we actually met each other in Amsterdam. I think we have a few things to say about that before. Well, the concept development. Yeah. I mean. Before all the other guys dropped in, Lee, Tony, Matt, Basse, it was just, well, I think it was Ton approached us. When did you do that? Like at Blender conference or at SIGGRAPH or whatever? Yeah. You said you had this crazy idea about making this movie with 6 maniacs in a giant, in a small room filled with computers or something. Yeah, and well, then you want to say something? You're looking at me like you're listening. Yeah. Well, do you want to go on? Well, I don't know. I don't really know what to talk about. So, well, hand it to me. We can talk about it. Come on. Well, we could just talk. Well, the problem solving. Well, so the first. So when Bassam and I got into this crazy world of Tons, we thought about ways of we started pretty early on with the concept and everything, and pretty much everything was based around what can we do actually? What is doable by a team of 6 people in 6 months? So we pretty much restricted the characters that had to be in the movie down to 2. And we kind of thought we couldn't do a lot of lip sync, and we couldn't do many shots and a lot of complicated things, which in the end, of course, was mixed all over again. But yeah, Bassam and I, developed several concepts, several little short pages filled with ideas and stuff. And I think you can tell us something about your concepts. You had this crazy thing about 2 crooks in a car driving around a freeway, and you want to talk? Yeah, sure.
One of the ideas was a totally unmakeable concept that I came up with,
It's funny.
which was the idea was that there would be the 2 characters again, and that they would kind of change throughout the story, and so it would start out as a very simple, cliched cops and robbers pair of characters, and they'd be driving in a car for the whole movie. And in order to escape, they would have to escape into different stories. And as the thing evolved, they would actually change characters. And so it was unmakeable in the sense that even though it was 2 characters, we'd end up having to make much more than 2 characters to actually make the movie. And this giant city kind of environment for them to be driving around in, and that was constantly changing all the time. So that was an unmakeable one, I think, and at least in the time constraints that we had.
But I mean,
there was.
No. You want to talk? You want to say something?
I was just going to say that Andy also had another story that was revolving around a train station that he might want to talk about.
Well, not really. It's a movie that is still. I'm still thinking about making it by myself, so can't really say that much about it. Well, I don't know. I'm never gonna finish it. It's too complicated. Involves a giant train station with millions of people and blah 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 blah. You know, and well, you can see that we didn't really wanted to do something ordinary. We wanted to do something that is strange, that kind of fits our way of thinking, and so some of us came up with this other concept, which was basically just one line. Was 2 guys in a giant infinite machine doing and
I think that was your idea.
could be mine, yeah. And that you can see. When was that? I think that was close to deadline. That was right at the beginning, because Bassam still has little hair. Yeah, he got hairier by the day. That's Basse, who can't be here sadly today. All right, he's gonna.
Do you want to talk about some of these other things? How much time do we have?
I think we can just talk the whole day. I don't know. If you can, if you can stand us for so long, I don't know. Yeah, they had a lot of fun. So, you want to say something? I don't know. Well, so we settled on this 2 guys in a giant machine idea, and then the other guys dropped in and said, "Hey, that's cool. Let's do something even more strange." And so, yeah, that was it. So, first scriptwriter. Yeah, the first scriptwriter. First hour we talked with her was actually pretty positive, but after that, I think after a couple of weeks after that, she just silently jumped off the project. Yeah, which was a good idea.
She felt disconnected with us because we are computer nerds in her perception. And she felt really disconnected, but she thought, well, maybe that disconnection I feel, I can put it in the script and make one of the characters, the pro character, the poet, who is a poet and doesn't understand anything about this technology stuff. and have his perception fighting with the things you see on the screen. Which was, of course, very interesting because it was what Elephant Dream became in the end too. But while she was working on it, she couldn't get it done. She just didn't fit, and I think 1 or 2 weeks before we started the project, she dropped out. She said, I'm not going to do it. But then we had this big problem of starting a project without a script, which is of course a sin. You never should start a movie project if you don't have a script. But we thought, okay, we can't do anything else, so we found a new script writer, and we used the first weeks with the team and the script writer to develop it further.
So the first few, after we got the studio together and we had the first draft of the script, we started making animatics. The first one was the Crappy-matic, and it was based on an early draft of the script that had something like 12 scenes. It had 8 pages worth of dialogue, and it was basically done where each person sat by themselves, and we broke it down. I basically took the script and I broke it down into a list of shots, and we just handed each artist a scene and said, okay, make it in animatic format however you want, you know. So some people wanted to do mostly 2D drawings, and some people made rough their own rough rigs of the characters that they used, and we put it all together, and of course none of them matched with each other, and the whole thing looked a little bit embarrassing and disjointed, and so we said, okay, now we have to make another animatic, and we had a newer script at the time, and so we made one in a more organized fashion where we were communicating better with each other and trying to use more consistent looks and feels and more discussion while we were making it. And we made the second animatic, which was also based on a very long script compared to what you saw in the final movie. And again, we checked it out, and it really wasn't working very well. For one thing, there was so much dialogue in it that some of the scenes got incredibly long with just talking heads talking back and forth to each other, and we weren't doing much cool environment things happening animation. And it was just not working, and so we kind of stepped back a little bit, and we decided that we'd have to trim the script down to a much shorter length to actually even be able to make it in time. And so we did that over a few days, and we went from 12 pages of dialogue to 1, and we went from 12 scenes to 8 scenes. However, some of those scenes are in the same location, and we quickly made a final animatic based on that breakdown. We made a new breakdown, and then we made a final animatic, and we actually never finished the animatic to the length of the whole movie. We made 80% of the movie or 90% of it, and the last scene was always a little bit of a mystery, and then we just started production.
Well, the last scene was really funny because it was always just this really long title coming towards you which said big epic battle, and we never really finished that, so I think that wasn't a good idea. So well, as you can see, the basic idea was just we let the scriptwriter fill in the gaps, and we just come up with all these strange visuals, and let the scriptwriter focus on the dialogues and everything, which he should be good at. And should we talk about anything else? The actors. Well, that was later. I guess we found them later, so it's not. I don't know. Animatic. You can see. Is that the animatic or the crappy-matic?
That looks like animatic.
That looks.
Because
Yeah.
it's using the same.
Just press that
proxy
twice.
characters.
Yeah, just press ZZ. Yeah. Yeah, and this originally
Oh, this is
really
animatic?
cool scene. Okay, it's not that cool at all, but the scriptwriter thought, okay, we should have the two characters sitting in front of a fire, and one guy should be spitting
Camera
tequila.
picture doesn't work.
Yeah, the one guy should be spitting tequila into the fire, and Prug should be really annoyed by it. And at the end, we didn't think that was a good idea, and many people responded to it as they thought it was a lesson against alcohol, so we dropped it.
Because we don't want to give that message out ever.
Definitely not. But yeah, it's kind of surprising how similar the animatic, well, the final movie is to the animatic. So we didn't deviate from it that much. It's a bit shorter, and the movie got longer and shorter over the whole period. So yeah, but not much changed. One of the scenes that didn't change actually much was the typewriter scene, wasn't it? Yeah.
It changed a little bit, but not too much. We had some different ideas about it. So I think in one of the early ideas for it, this is the picking the glass out of the broken glass out of emo.
After the tequila explosion.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a scene that was cut again.
But the dialogue in this one was, can't you see, what was it, how
Yeah.
beautiful this place is? No, how perfect it is.
Yes. The dialogue in this actually lasted till the final cut, but the scene is completely changed.
At the end of the scene, you would see all like bars around the screen. It should be looking like a prison.
In the original script, Emo gets killed twice, not once. And so this is the first time he dies, and then he sort of comes back in this magical, grand ending, and then gets killed again at the end of that. And
Maybe not.
or maybe not, but we decided that we really didn't have the time to kill Emo twice in the same movie, so we settled for doing it just once.
As much as we wanted it to.
Yeah, it would have been good, but you know. Yeah, I think we had resolved that by that point, but that was an early discussion. We were talking about the initial idea for the movie was that it was basically a battle of ideas between Emo and Prug, and which continued throughout, but with a big difference in that Emo doesn't actually have a point of view in the final movie. In the initial one, it was Prug trying to force his ideas on Emo, and Emo having his own different ideas that were supposed to be sort of doing battle with each other. And we never really did it quite that way. Instead, Prug is trying to force a point of view on Emo, and we never see what Emo's perspective actually is.
Should we talk about that?
Sure, why not?
Explain
Well, how the
it's all
characters
about
evolved.
and what it worked.
How the characters evolved and all that. Yeah, let's talk. Well, you got some.
Yeah. I can give a brief
Let's just.
I can give a brief kind of explanation for the movie, since a lot of people have asked those questions about what the movie is about, and I'll give it away.
What is the movie about?
Okay, now I can answer that.
We can.
The movie is about these two characters, Prug and Emo, and it's about the concept that when you have a so-called reality, like a human reality, a social interaction, it's something invented, and it's something agreed upon by consensus or by violence. And in the case of Prug, he's invented this reality around him, and everything you see in the movie is Prug's invented world. And Emo doesn't see it. He doesn't have the mechanism to understand it, perhaps because Prug is slightly insane and he's really making it up or hallucinating it. And so Prug he's invented this world that he's very comfortable with. Primarily, our backstory for the character is that he's a paranoid character who's afraid of interaction with other people or with the real world that we agree on, and that he's invented this giant machine that sort of protects him from everything. And it's basically a big series of traps that prevent him from having to communicate with the real world. And all the traps, all the scenes in the movie are constructed based on some sort of communication device. So it could be a telephone or telegraph wires or a typewriter, or even the elevator scene is actually modeled off a camera lens. And so it's something that people use to communicate with each other. But in Prug's case, it's a way to like cut him off from communication. It becomes a trap. But he can't just have his own reality in his head and feel absolutely confident of it. He has to teach it to someone else. and he picks on this character Emo, who's maybe just there because he's talking to him, and he decides that he's going to initiate him into his machine. And as he takes him in sort of deeper and deeper into his world, he starts to realize that Emo isn't really capable of seeing it, and Prue gets more frustrated and more scary and kind of violent, at which point Emo rebels against him. There's a scene sort of in the middle of the movie where Emo hears some strange music, and you see this door show up, and Emo says, "Can we go to this place?" And that's sort of the only place in the movie where you see some representation, perhaps, of what Emo might be seeing. That maybe they're walking by a bar or something like that, and he hears music inside and he wants to go there. And Prug obviously wouldn't want to go to a place like that. I mean, that's a place where you have contact with lots of other people, and so he doesn't want to go there. And when Emo finally realizes that this guy is a bit nuts and a bit violent, and he just walks off, and as he, for instance, when he walks off, Prug had them sort of being in this small enclosed room. And so when Emo just walks, the wall starts moving, because Prug has to start justifying how Emo is moving that way. And so as Emo's walking away, and Prug's in this mode where he's justifying his action, Emo stops and starts mocking Prug. And so he's not actually creating anything. He's just saying, "Oh, you're just saying all this stupid stuff, and I'll do something crazy too." But the problem is that Prug, because of he's in this mode, starts sort of seeing this reality. It starts impinging on his ideas, and so he starts seeing Emo's mocking words sort of destroying what he had built up, and he can't really take it, and he can't really do anything about it. And so finally he realizes that the only way he can stop it is to just stop Emo from talking, and he bum rushes him, and that's the end of the movie. We were going to do a little bit more stuff in that final scene. I wanted him to try using his stick and that remote control button to stop this stuff from happening first, but we actually ran out of time. Towards the end, we were rushing that final scene out, so I cut it out. I figured, well, it's implied, kind of, so that's kind of really what the story is, or what the basis of it is.
I mean, as much as we put into the story, I think there's still a lot of room left to the viewer to interpret it by themselves, I think.
That's true to a certain extent. There's also we even didn't agree 100% what the underlying themes of it was. So some people would say, oh, it's like a religious kind of, like a religious person trying to impose a religious viewpoint on somebody else and make them kind of accept it. And obviously they don't tolerate any deviation. And for me personally, it didn't have to be about religion at all, because really anything that we kind of accept as social reality has that kind of both this arbitrary invented aspect to it, but it also has this kind of necessity, like you have to accept it. And a simple example is money. Money is just made up stuff, it's numbers. But you really don't tolerate any deviation in how you handle it. I can't just take money from somebody in an unaccepted way, and if I do, I meet some kind of violent reaction from everyone else who are trying to enforce this idea of property and economy on me, So I can't just decide to go a different way but maybe with good ideas there's more of a consensus, or in an ideal world everyone kind of will agree on it, that it's towards the common good, whereas in a worst case situation you have one person just deciding what they want and trying to force it on everybody else. And that's kind of what Prug should be learning in this movie, is that he can't just be the sole arbiter.
That's one of the interesting tragedies at the end, is that Prug is able to have this world and confirm it in his own mind by talking about it to Emo and trying to teach it to Emo and make him understand it. Because the more Emo agrees with Prug and says, oh, yeah, okay, I guess, then that's Prug's way of confirming it in his own mind. But at the end, when Prug hits Emo and Emo is gone, it's a sort of hollow victory for Prug, because now he has no student to teach and nobody to talk about. So he's left without that sense of confirmation in his own world. It's kind of empty.
That's true, and that's why if you notice that if you watch the movie, you notice that the first shot and the last shot are both sort of overhead shots with the camera sort of moving in a similar way, and that's because the beginning of the movie is, and in the beginning of the movie you see kind of little destructed bits of the machine and things that you see later on in the movie, and that's kind of tying the two things together, because Prug talking in the beginning is actually sort of him trying to remember. It's actually taking place after the events of the rest of the short, and it's Prug sort of trying to pull it together and make sense out of what just happened, and then he slips into the memory of it, and so what you see is Prug remembering these events, and after he hits Emo and Emo falls, you have that same shot to sort of visually provide a link between the beginning and the end.
Okay, well, I have some notes here I may as well go through. One thing that was interesting, was just the experience that we took out of it from learning little things and solving little problems. So we can talk about that now. One thing that was different for us from most other projects is that when we were actually rendering the files, our bottleneck wasn't the processing power, because we had this huge big render farm in the United States, the Bowie State University XSeed, which they graciously donated to us. Well, not to us, but we were able to use it. And what that meant was, because it was in the United States, our bottleneck wasn't the actual processing of the rendering, but it was the bandwidth in getting the rendered frames back from the US to Amsterdam. Because we were rendering in HD resolution OpenEXR files, and those were generally around 5 megabytes a file. And with compression and everything on, without compression, it'd be about 20 megabytes. So when you add that all up, that's several hundred megabytes just for a second or two of animation, which made things really difficult to actually check to see that the render had actually come out right, or and so on. So one interesting thing which Ton coded was, if you can still see it in Blender. Oops, no, that's not it. You don't want to look at that. Yeah, that's my own version. I'll go back to this one. Yeah, it does. It's no point showing everyone if it's not in the same. Here we go. So there's OpenEXR. This little button here called Preview, as well as rendering an OpenEXR frame, it also saves a little JPEG, which is still compressed pretty well. It's at like 90% JPEG compression, but it's also a lot smaller file size. So what that enabled us to do is that when the things were rendering on the server, we could then just download the preview JPEGs and check out those JPEGs without having to download the whole OpenEXR frames. Then once we'd looked at the JPEGs and played them back and confirmed that everything was correct, then we could download the OpenEXRs. But a lot of the time, this was really useful, because we'd look at the first couple of JPEGs and think, oh, and here are the rendering errors, we need to redo it again, or oh, this animation isn't matching up, and so on and so forth. If we had to actually download the real OpenEXR frames to be able just to see that we'd made a mistake, we would have lost so much time just in waiting around for file transfers. So that was an interesting problem that we solved to do with our particular circumstance.
Even so, the Montevideo guys got really angry at us because they don't really have a fast connection there. It was just ADSL. It was just ADSL. So we dumped their whole connection down, and they were getting angry at us.
Yeah. So the solution to that was that during daytime we had like two sort of scripts running. One like uploading the blend files to the render farm to the States, and another like taking the frames back both with rsync, which cleverly only transfers what needed. So we had that in two modes, that in daytime, or when we were working at the studio and there were other people in the building as well, it was only pulling the JPEGs, and then usually for the night we put it to the EXR mode. So hopefully overnight we also got the full frames back, and nobody was angry because no one else was working there at that time.
Towards the end, I mean, got all mixed because we were rushing everything, and we had to transfer the EXRs now, because then we didn't finish that deadline, and we were going really crazy. So yeah, there were a couple of issues with that.
Another thing to do with that file transfer issue was this idea of compositing, because in most movie productions where you will have like a local render farm on a local network, they'll render out their 3D renders in passes. So they'll have the different layers, they'll have the different passes, and then they'll get all of those different frame sequences and then composite them together. And that's a very fast way of working, because you don't actually have to render something to be able to see what you're working on. But the other problem is that you need a lot of disk space for it. If you've got, some of our shots had up to 10 or so different passes or layers. So if you've got 10 times 5 megabytes for each frame sequence, it gets extraordinarily heavy, and that's just was unacceptable for us. So one of the ways of working, which is great in the new Blender compositor that was written while we were working on it, at the end, is that you can actually work on your composite without rendering out any files, without actually saving files down to disk. You can just pipe the render layers and render passes straight into the compositor, press render, and up comes the image that you can tweak, you can add the effects, you can do your color correction then. And then once it's the compositing process, you've got it all set up the way you want it, then we were just able to send that one blend file off to the render farm and get one OpenEXR finished composite file back. Instead of having to split it up into lots of different frame sequences, we were able to just do all of the compositing processing on the servers and get one file back, which is the only way we were able to do it. Question?
What your technical environment was, size of your file, size of your network, capacity of your systems, and if you ran into any problems like you're mentioning now with those systems, or if you would have loved to have this while you were doing that.
The question was, for the benefit of people watching the videos online, what was the setup that we were using with our network, with our computer systems, with the size of our files, and all of that sort of technical stuff that, governed what we were doing. We had, Tony, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, well, basically, like locally in the studio, we had like 6 powerful workstations, dual processors and 2 gigabytes memory, and one even with 4, and then we had a local server hosting the SVN Subversion repository, and and we also had a shared disk there, and those were like, that server had like 2 300 gigabyte disks, so that was enough, and then the workstations had little disks like 120 or like around 100 gigabytes, and because the workstations only hosted the blend files mostly, and
Workstations had everything.
but I mean the not all the rendered, so mostly the like the source files in that sense. So and we had a 1 gigabit network, 1 gigabit switch within the studio. So I think inside the studio everything worked well. It was not a problem for even in the end, like doing video encodings over the net and that sort of stuff. But because of this peculiar situation with having the render farm so far away, there was this bandwidth problem with the transatlantic transfer of the big files back. But the file sizes, well, here we can see some of the blend files that they vary quite a lot, but are not usually huge. textures are, of course, the biggest files. Some textures were, I guess, like 70 megabytes at least, or even 200 megabytes per texture image.
Depending on what they were used for, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
those big ones with the big character facial textures. For other things like little environment pieces, it didn't need to be so big, of course. Just on that note, I remember when I left the studio, we were using Subversion, SVN, to store all of our data. And I remember when I left the studio at the end of the project, I copied all of my production files to my laptop. And in total, that was about 15 gigabytes. We managed to narrow that down to about 10 or so to fit on the DVDs by discarding old work-in-progress stuff, and etc.
The actual Subversion repository, the checkouts were very fast, actually. On the local network, it was pretty speedy. Of course, we weren't doing full checkouts every day. We were just doing updates.
Do you want to tell the people who don't know what Subversion is?
Okay, Okay, Subversion is a SVN. It's originally a source control, version control system for coding, actually, but it has it does do binary diffing on binary files, and it does compression. So it seemed like it was a useful tool to use even for a non-code oriented project, and so that's what we used. We had the local server that was in the studio had the Subversion server and repository on it, and what that does is when an artist makes a file, they add it to the repository and they check it in, and then everyone who does an update gets that file, and as you work and you update the file, you check in your updates, and the Subversion keeps track of all the changes you make to it, so you can always go back a few days and get an old version of the same file. So the repository has all the versions of all the production files, and actually is smaller in size than a single checkout. So a checkout is what you have on your workstation, which is all the production files. The repository has all the different versions, but because it's so compressed and it's using diffs, it's actually smaller than a checkout, even for big binary files like this, which was something we were nervous about when we started because we didn't know how well it would scale. I even did a checkout remotely from the US when I went back and the server was still online. I booted up my home computer and I checked out Elephant's Dream production files, and it took about 24 hours, but the slowness there was transferring the files over the internet basically, and not the actual repository itself. So that was pretty cool.
If somebody's interested in the version control, there's an early blog post from over a year ago when we installed it and set it up, and there's some useful comments from other people about using Subversion for binary stuff as well. And
I wonder how much spam is there now. Oh,
that's been,
that's better.
So you have a production tree in the SVN, which you can synchronize with the render farm as well. It's important that at any moment the render farm can start working with only one SVN update command. It just gets everything that has changed from the production tree and copies that to the server, and then you can start working. And of course there were a lot of local directories too, so people could have temporal files or whatever outside of the production tree. You can find a couple of that on the DVD, but most of it was in the production tree. And because of SVN, you also only had to store one file. I mean, if you work by yourself, you typically make file 1, 1.2, 5, 6, 7, because you want to have your own history. But by using SVN, you don't have to worry about the history. So there's only one file, as you can see, which is called proof head texture. And you don't have to make it proof head texture 1, version 2, version 3, and so on.
Question?
Did you use the Blender feature, the library feature, and if you did so, how did you use it?
It's a good question. Yeah, we did use the Blender library feature quite a bit, actually. It's great for production this size. We had in our production folder, we had a library folder which had also blend files and texture files, basically everything that gets linked into the scene files. And so there's the scene files in their own directories, and they're just typically one file per shot, and they link.
For example, scene 4, shot 5, and so on.
And they link data that's in the lib directory. For instance, for the sets, they can be linked in. Initially, we wanted to link everything, and so we wanted to make it that our characters were always linked, library linked into the scene files. In practice, that doesn't work very well because you run into issues. Blender doesn't want to let you edit library linked data in the file that's linking it, and so that limits what you can do for animation with the characters. You can't really readily pose them once they're linked in, for instance, so you can't really animate. There are some things that we tried to do to get working, but our production deadlines were getting too close that we couldn't really afford to spend the time on that to get it working reliably enough that we could count on it. And so for the characters, we appended instead of linked. And so we had local copies of the characters in each scene file. And then we would, towards the end of the production, because we were actually tweaking the rigs almost until the last day of animation. And especially when we started doing final renders and really eyeballing deformation problems in like corner cases that were happening in some shots. So we would have to replace the character rigs and the character models in those shot files, and that basically entailed deleting the old stuff and reappending the new stuff in, and applying all the animation data or custom constraints that we had done in the files back onto it. Tony wrote a couple of scripts to make at least the parts that are always the same, like the deletion and the appending, faster, but you still had to give it a little bit of manual attention per file and check that it's still animated the same way at the end. For some of the secondary characters, we didn't have to do that. For instance, the little mechanical birds, the ducks, Swiss Army ducks, they can be appended, they can be linked, because what we did with those is that we created a library of actions for those characters, and that library resides in the library area of Blender. And when you link them as a group, which means that you link that group, and then you can duplicate it as many times as you want in your scene. And even though you can't pose them, you can use the NLA to drop action strips on them at different times or speeds. And because they're secondary characters, and you really can't really just animate them like as principal hero characters for each shot, or we'd run out of time, animating them for the shot just meant grabbing them in there and grabbing library actions and dropping it and editing it in the NLA, and that worked fine. That worked really well. Textures are also linked. I mean, that's separate from Blender data, but so we linked textures. The materials were part of the object, but the texture was linked. And we also linked some of the set stuff. So we would have a low-res, often both linked. We would have a low-res proxy set that the animators would have that would be fast to pan and zoom around. And then we would have the full final resolution version of that. And they were both linked into the scene, either linked on different layers, or maybe when the people were rendering, they would just swap them. And so that worked really well, actually. So the only kind of limitation that we had was that we couldn't really animate a character that was linked in.
About the character, if you had the armature that was not linked, and linked only the character mesh that was modified by that armature, that wouldn't work, or what was the problem there?
I tried just about every combination of that, and none of them worked.
And the library system in Blender was used in the past only to link like a whole background set or something, so you can separate things. And in Orange we learned that you can do and need actually much more advanced ways of using the libraries. And it was a total nightmare to coach something like that, because you can imagine how complicated things can become if you have multiple levels of libraries, multiple files, but also multiple levels deep. And you can have in Blender a link to another file, which in that file links to another file, which in that file links to another file, which links back even to a higher file. It can all link and do things, and then when one link breaks, you either get a crash or your whole scene doesn't work anymore. It's horrible. So I spent a lot of time on fixing at least these bugs we found, but I couldn't fix the things that were more features, which would help Bassam a lot, because you want to have a character library. He wants to, because rigging, I mean, I've learned how complex it is. It is really not like, you rig for like a day and then you use it for 2 months. No, you rig 2 months and you use the end result as an automatic machine for artists with an interface that they can animate it. And while you do that, he can fix things in the rigs to make it more advanced, and all the animation files that use that still work. He can make sure that this is possible. So ideally, we would like to have a full linked character. Now you got the problem, if you link things, you cannot change it. That's the whole principle of linking. So you have to find a way to localize parts of data in your blend to change the linked stuff. That was when I started with the groups. People know groups. With the groups you can do that, because groups is on object level, and on an object you can add actions and NLA, and the NLA is talking to the data of the character. So the only thing that was missing was the fact that it's not only fun to use the NLA in actions, the character animators want to pose. They want to create more actions. So you should be able to edit inside of the group the character. Even when you don't save that, the editing means you create actions. And that's a little feature, and I know I have to do it because the Plumiferas guys are dying for it. But when you can do edited groups, completely linked, you solve a lot of the issues we had been fighting with.
I just want to add another complication to that, is that when you're animating a scene, you typically need to add some constraints that aren't in the rig. They're just custom for that shot. If a character picks up something, you need to constrain it to his hand, or you need to constrain the hand to it. If you switch IK, FK, I mean, if you're using IK at all, chances are you're adding another constraint on there for arms. And so you might end up with a scene with a bunch of empties, and the rigs are constrained to those empties in some ways, or to each other. And those are custom constraints that are added on top. And so any successful linking system for character animation would have to be able to preserve those local constraints. In our case, we had to analyze each file, see where we had done custom things, and what I did I'd made sure I only constrained to the armature. You know, that was a rule that we put in the project. And then I would delete all the meshes and everything else and just leave the old armature and rename it sometimes, and then import the new stuff. And if you were really in a hurry, you could just leave the old armature there with the constraints on it, but oftentimes you would have to just transfer those empty constraints to the new armature and then delete the old one.
I take it. I believe it's getting a bit too technical, especially for artsy-fartsy people like me. So let's kick in between with some funny and witty anecdotes of the project. Matt.
What?
I don't know. I forgot about everything that happened in those 7 months. So.
I just like to know what SVN you used, what software to control it, and if it was an intranet or an internet, if it was people were able to reach it outside, and which leads me to another question: if somehow somebody outside Montevideo that was not, meeting in Rio, virtually collaborated with some work to the movie.
Okay, let's talk about more technical things.
Our repository was internal only. It was only, only internet, only inside the room, and apart from the syncing to the States, and the collaboration with the people outside was just case by case. Like if Andy, for example, had asked someone to do something, then he communicated with him, and then only Oranges put files to the repository. We have had plans to put it online, and no, it's not as an SVN repository. I don't think it's is it?
It was.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was an exception to that. There was a period where I actually left the studio and I worked from home from the States, and we opened a port up. I think we changed the default. It was an SSH, a secure shell port, and we changed the default port number, and we had a port open which was passworded that I would log in, and I did SVN updates from the United States. I had taken my laptop, which had a checkout, with me home, and I was doing updates. It took longer to do over the internet than it did locally, but I did work that way. But that was the only case. Yeah, it's possible. The other collaborators, typically we emailed files back and forth, and then people checked them in locally. For SVN, well, SVN is SVN, and it does all the server-side stuff. It also has client software that's command line for the checkouts. There's also various front ends that the Mac guys use. On Linux, I used ESVN, which is a GUI front end for it, and the Mac people can tell us what they use.
I can't remember, but there's plenty out there. I mean, Google knows all. So, should we continue on? Okay, something a bit more light-hearted. We can go through, because when you put like 6 crazy people in a room together for 7 months, we sometimes ended up doing some pretty silly things. So I thought it might be fun to go through some of the things behind the scenes and in the movie that you may not notice at first glance, but gave us a bit of enjoyment. One thing that is interesting to remember if you're making a movie is that you're acting for the camera, and that you don't need to animate everything that's going on in the entire scene. It's really only the camera that matters. So if you actually open up some of the blend files in the DVD, you'll notice that some things are pretty strange. For example, no?
Since this was a production and we were always wanting to get the most out of every shot, sometimes, well, a lot of things will be made in the frame. Anything that's outside the frame doesn't matter at all unless it will be seen in the frame later or it has some effect on what's in the frame. And during many of the shots, for example, myself or Bassam and Basse too, we were really the animators for a certain time, animating a lot of the shots. We would, if something was out of the camera, we wouldn't animate it, we'd just leave it. And it would end up that I'd look out after animating a shot and you'd just see someone floating, or, you know, the rules don't apply. It's all art, it's illusion. Smoke and mirrors.
Next one. Elevator doors.
Oh, yeah. There were some things that were added afterwards. For example, with the animation at least, we first began with the animatic, and that progressed into what would be the final animation. For example, I would get a file in that was the animatic. Nothing would be final, no set, no lighting, no nothing, just the animatic, and we would take in the final characters, and then it was our job to animate them in their final state. The animatic helped out a lot with what would where they would be going. The hardest part in the animation being trying to work out where a foot would go, their basic motion, and that would take the most time and the most amount of tweaking and working out where does he stand, how does he jump. And in the end, when that was found out, the easy part was just adding details, making their fingers move, and it just came in levels.
Just want to have an interjection about that. Just a small interjection. We use the animatic as reference when we're building actual scene shot files. So the animatic files had one file per scene, which was using a camera switching script to change the shots between different cameras. And the animators used mostly the video from that as reference. We didn't typically, though you could, we didn't typically open the animatic file and then start refining that particular file because it didn't really have anything that was really useful to you. It didn't have any of the sets linked. It didn't have any of the actual characters linked. It had the animatic characters in it. And so we constructed each shot file by itself, which is much more convenient, actually, because if you have this file that's for the whole scene, especially if the characters move around a big distance and a lot of things change, then it's really a lot of detail and extra stuff that you don't need when you're making a single shot. And doing it that way lets the person concentrate on just that one shot and not have to get kind of scattered around between different things.
Yeah, definitely. Did you want to?
Yeah, here's just another example of doing stuff in camera. You may, if you've seen the movie, which I hope you all have, this is where Prug and Emo step into the elevator for the first time, and the giant, big, rusty elevator doors come closing down in front of them. And of course, again, if you look in the actual blend file, you'll see that the big rusty elevator doors are just that big.
And that was where the sound played a good part as well, because they sound humongous, or a lot bigger and fuller than they are. And for us as artists, working with one corner of a scene and everything is just free 3D space. Once Jan had added the sound in and we got back the files with music and sound, it added a whole world to it, which we were amazed at as well. It created a world in which we hadn't modeled it or textured it or animated it. It just appeared through what our ears were hearing, and that was a good thing, a good joining between adding the audio in and how much of an effect that has on a movie. It was something that surprised me personally, at least. And as we began animating from the animatics, we split off into groups in the end, so to speak. I mean, we were quite free as 6 guys. We would pass something back and forth, knowing who could do what better. But during the higher points of the production, it really became 3 animators and 3 people working on a lot of the rendering and lighting aspects.
2 people.
Yeah, 2 people. And, someone assisting, of course, on those 2. And it became quite a good team. We would split up, but we were quite organic. Sometimes we would be 3 animators, sometimes 2 animators, and 3 people would be lighting. It was quite good to see that working in such a small team. And some bigger companies as well actually do work like this, having, so to speak, many small versions of what we were doing, or many versions of us, group of 6 or 8 people, and a bunch of them together that were working on a scene or something, and that would come together to make a feature. So if there were 9 of us put together, into different sections, maybe it would have become a feature that way.
Here's another little funny thing that we did. There's a couple of homages to other movies in Elephant's Dream, and I don't know if you've spotted them, but here we're going to reveal at least one of them anyway, which is in one of our favorite movies. Let's just play this back.
It took 3 of us to animate this to get it how we wanted it.
So it's in not this shot, but the next shot, where Prug has the sort of glistening in his eyes and he looks up and then makes this little smirky facial expression. Like that. And that's actually a tribute to one of our favorite movies, Blade Runner, because if you look in a certain shot in Blade Runner, as a famous Dutch hour, Rutger Hauer, has just killed his father, traveling in an elevator, no less. He makes a similar kind of expression. So there's that. There's a few others. I don't know if any of you guys have seen the movie Zardoz with Sean Connery, a very campy 70s movie. I can show you a little clip from it. Where are we? Yeah, I've got it. Yeah, it's a very high quality movie.
Most important thing, it has Sean Connery and what is it?
Red underpants. We watched it. We watched it while we were making it, and it kind of rubbed off on us.
We ended up getting the poster of the movie, which is Sean Connery in this wonderful outfit, and we stuck it on the door. And we were in the studio where across the back were some wonderful ladies working on a different part of Montevideo, and they would come past and see, we've got all these posters up of Sean Connery in a bikini suit and things like that. So they thought we were a bit kooky. That was okay. Luckily, we weren't disturbed.
So of course we had to put that in the movie too. So if you look in the background next to the door here, in the next shot as Prug is walking past, right about here, you can see Sean Connery standing with his gun on the wall. What else is there? Oh yeah, that's another one. Let me just skip backwards.
That is indeed a giant floating stone head. Just for the record.
Yes, that is a floating stone head, so you all know.
I don't know if I can catch this one, but let's try. If you actually open up the textures in the scene files, you'll see that each of the typewriter keys has a little picture on it, a little logo / design type thing. And in the one that hits the duck to make it explode, there's a very special logo on there. I'm not sure if I can get it. Let's just try and skip through. There we go. What else is there? Oh yeah, yeah. Let's see if I can. Oh no, that's another one. Within our project, the number 264 was something that kept reoccurring. So we put it on the door over here, because Montevideo was number 264 on Kaisersgracht, the street name. When we submitted for SIGGRAPH, we were number 264, and we were making all of these files to pass with Jan with H264 codec. So we put all of these little sort of traces of our working, so that when we actually watch the movie, we can think, oh yeah, I remember that. What else?
It was also the total number of hours of sleep the entire team had over the project.
There's also just simpler stuff. The first and last shot of the movie are actually kind of lifted from the movie Stalker. And the inspiration for the telephone room is also from that movie. And you may not have noticed this, but in the telephone scene where he holds up the telephone and there are all of these disgusting little worm type creatures inside the telephone, we decided to put one of those worms
over the basin here hanging on a hook. And as Emo walks away in one of the next shots, we thought it would be fun if the little worm could jump off his hook. Where are we?
By the way, that thing in the background, that's a head snarler. Just
Okay, so here's the little worm. Whoop. Yeah. We called them worms. You called them something different. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of these little stupid things going on in there. Like, actually, in some of those, if you open up the blend file and look inside these jars on the shelf, you'll see the head of Suzanne and also a disembodied brain. No one will ever see that, but oh well. But yeah, if you have the time, go and look through in great detail, because we put a lot of love and care and had a lot of fun, and there's some little gems that you might find and have a chuckle about yourself.
I think we got 10 minutes left. Maybe we should use that for if people have some questions about the movie, about time we had, or want to give us some critique. Maybe.
Yeah, I find that the movie is very compact. I mean, it's amazing how people that have been different people that have been working randomly in some phases. That's what I understood. Like the case was moving the script in several directions. It's amazing that the movie has a unity, and that's very beautiful. But how old were all of you when you made the movie summed together?
I don't know.
We never actually figured that number out. And in some cases, we don't like to say how old we are, so.
You look like 20 or so.
Yeah, we could do that, I guess. Any other questions while we're coming up with that number?
I don't know exactly how old these guys are.
What?
Yeah, roughly 150 or so between the, 6 of us? Yeah. Yeah, any more questions?
I mean, even if you want to say something about the movie, what you felt, what do you think about the design, animation, whatever.
Just a small technical question, only short. Did you use Linux as for the workstations and server or other systems? And why this distribution?
Well, I can say I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but we had 3 Linux workstations which were all running Ubuntu. We had 1 Sun workstation which was running Ubuntu too, and we had luckily we had 2 Macs donated by Apple. Well, not donated, but we got a discount, whatever. Yeah. So. Well, luckily, because we didn't have to buy them. I don't know. I'm fine with Linux. I have it on my laptop. I don't have any problems with Linux. I like it.
The movie was edited with the Blender video sequencer, and if yes, how did you manage to work with the sound? Because I can't quite use the sound with the video sequencer yet.
Well, the sound can probably answer that one.
Yes, we did use the video sequencer for the editing. The sound, you can import either movies with sound or sound wave files into the video sequencer, and they work. There are some issues with the sound and the sequencer sound in Blender. I think it depends. It's a little bit platform dependent what kind of issues there are. My experiences with Linux and for this project too is that at least the, the way it's implemented, there's actually two sound systems in Blender. There's OpenAL that's used for the game engine sound, and there's SDL that's used for the video sequencer sound. And one thing to note is that the SDL in Blender, at least by default, wants to use an OSS. It wants to basically have total control over the DSP of the sound card. And so anything else that's using the sound will stop Blender sound from working and vice versa, including Blender's own game engine sound. So to use the video sequencer sound, you have to disable the game engine sound or it won't work. Also, Ubuntu has a sound server running by default, and it has certain SDL output plugins by default, so you have to do a bunch of stuff to make it work. For our movie, we actually didn't figure out those technical issues, so we got sound cards that had hardware mixing on board, and then it worked. And so, because some sound cards do mixing in hardware, and you can have multiple clients sort of attaching to the same hardware and it works, and that's what we went for doing the project. The cool thing about using the sequence editor for the project, other than that kind of sound hiccups, was we did a live edit while we were working on the movie, and we were getting at first OpenGL preview clips from the animators, and then we were getting the JPEGs from the server, from the render farm, and we would drop them in as strips as we worked, and we had the animatic on one layer on top, and that way it wasn't kind of a system where you made all the shots and then at the end you edited it and you saw what you had. We were always editing and always checking out the edit, and it was useful to coordinate animation. Lee mentioned earlier that one of the scenes had 3 animators working at the same time, and that was Lee, Andy, and myself for that scene. And Andy was doing he did the mechanical elements in the scene. So he did like the capsule and he did the ducks. And Lee and me were doing the characters. And we would drop the shots in. They would do OpenGL renders and put them on the server, and I would drop them into the edit and then tell them, okay, you have to tweak the last pose in your shot. You have to change this motion so it matches with the next one. So we were able to make it, to edit on action with the characters from different animators animating and have it work sort of okay.
One thing, I sit down again. One thing not to forget, I mean, the production of the Elephant's Dream movie, within the studio we used only open source, but we also only focused on the computer graphics side and the editing of the movie. And we were very happy to be sponsored by a sound studio and music composer in Germany, Jan Morgenstern. He was actually the 7th member of the team, working really hard to get the sound edit and the voice edit done in time for us. But he did that in his studio externally. So we didn't do a lot of testing with audio editing or audio aspects of open source. That was all done in another studio.
Actually, our primary need for audio in the sequence editor was to use it for animating, because you would get the sound clip that had the characters talking for the animators to use. You drop that into the sequence editor as a WAV file, and then as you're scrubbing in your scene, you can hear that, and the animators can lip sync to it, and they can do the acting based on the character actors. And this works, yeah. Yeah, you have to disable game engine sound, or it won't work, unless you have a hardware mixing sound card. Some of the older Sound Blasters did that, and I think recently they've been going cheaper and doing the mixing in software, and that doesn't work so well. You can make it work, but it doesn't work so well.
I just want to add a note I use Ubuntu, I use Linux too, and I use it on my laptop, and everyone knows laptops don't have audio hardware mixing. and it works nice on my laptop. You just have to add an export command to the command line when you call Blender, and it works. And with FFmpeg compiled in Linux, you can even load MP3 and other sorts of AAC files and audio, and for me it works okay.
I did hear you mentioning that you have used real actors at a certain moment, and that has changed your way of animation a lot. That was what you told in the in the Gasthuis.
Well, luckily we had two really Dutch top-notch what are they theater and TV actors who were really helpful in getting the voices for the characters right. I mean, Bassam has witnessed them doing their magic. So.
Well, we also captured video from them too. So they did the voices, as you can hear, and we took the video from it, and it really helped. Not necessarily, we didn't use that in any technical way, but it really helps in the sense of you had some visual reference now, that you weren't just animating in kind of a blind, trying to come up with everything yourself. And having that visual reference for the motion, for the acting, really helps at least inspire the animator into constructing the performance of the character. So that was really good. And it also kind of gave us some kind of reference points too when we were making the shapes and designing the facial rigging of what kind of shapes that their faces could contort in when they were doing these different kind of kooky poses.
Yeah, we use their facial kind of features and how they express themselves with the voices a bit in the shots, but more so we would take their sound, and before we even animated, we would put the sound into the file and just listen to it and see what our minds were coming up with. And we looked at them and acting out the characters so much, I think, that they engraved themselves into our head a bit as well. So we were able to just listen to their voice and get kind of a picture as well that fit what we were going to animate. No, it wasn't a direct copy. It was inspired. We used, rather in some, I suppose, in some feature films such as Lord of the Rings, they would take Andy Serkis acting on screen and pretty much exact it with a 3D character. Sometimes as well, yeah, not all the time. But I suppose in our case, we really just used it as quite a reference to our own animating in the final shots.
Any more questions?
No.
No. No.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, that's it. Thank you very much.
A lot more.
Okay, we have a 1 hour break till 2 o'clock. There are sandwiches downstairs, so if you want to go grab lunch and talk and wander around. If the speakers for this afternoon could just come up and see me before you go down for lunch, then that would be great, and we can do a quick test. Thanks.